Ani Bojo, Mary Lynn here from Mawikwadong. I am doing the second in a series of videos, instructional videos on how to produce kombucha. So today we're going to do how we do our second ferment, which is where we get that bubbly sort of sensation with kombucha, if that's what you're looking for. So in our first video, we did our first ferment, and hopefully you have your jar with your finished kombucha that you checked somewhere between 7 to 10 days to see if the taste is what you like, it's as sharp as what you'd like. So now we're going to take this kombucha that has finished its first ferment, and we're going to be putting it into bottles. And this is where we are going to be capping the kombucha to sort of keep the CO2, the carbon dioxide that's produced by the bacteria and the yeast that are in kombucha, and trapping it inside the liquid. So we need jars that are used to holding the pressure, and not a lot of jars are that you find commercially. So do make sure that you're using the right kind of jars, or also you'll end up with a really interesting experiment all over your ceiling, which unfortunately has happened to me a few times, so learn from my failures. You can usually find these jars around from other people or at secondhand stores, so don't feel you have to go and invest a lot of money to buy something new. These are often found if you're close to a brew your own store. These are often used for beer production, so they're Grolsch bottles, or what the name brand is called. So do make sure though, you can often find a lot of decorative bottles that have these flip tops that aren't really meant to hold the pressure. So do make sure that it's an actual jar that can hold pressure. This is one type that you can get. It's also a great idea if you have friends or you've been drinking kombucha yourself, just to use what you've already been recycling. So if you have friends that buy kombucha, ask them if they could save these and not put them in their recycling bins. These jars are commercially made to withhold pressure internally, and also the lids are. A lot of people think they can use mason jars. Mason jars aren't. They actually have a very different function. When we're preserving foods and we're pressurizing them, what we're actually wanting to happen is all of the air to go out of those mason jars. So the lids, the seals, actually vacuum seal and all the air goes out. And so that's exactly opposite of what we're looking for. They're also not meant to hold internal pressure, pressuring out. So this is another great. This is a Canadian company that makes these. A lot of people use GTs. This may have been a brand that you've used. All of these bottles have the right kind of lid, right kind of glass to withhold pressure. So once you find those, roughly for a bottle this size of your first ferment, you're probably looking at 6 to 7 of these jars that you'll be able to fill from your first ferment. So I'm going to take off the lid that I had improvised to make sure that oxygen got back into our bacteria and yeast so it can grow. And I'm going to take out my SCOBY. And just so that you know what a SCOBY might look like after your first ferment, it often is floating. Sometimes it'll be on the side, sometimes even at the bottom. That's okay, it's all right. But what is going to have happened is probably there's going to be new growth on top of this SCOBY and probably on the surface of your kombucha. That's normal, and that's what we want to see. It means it's developing new bacteria and yeast cultures. So I'm going to take this SCOBY out, put it into a bowl to reserve. We're going to use it again for our next. And have a look. There may be other little pieces throughout your mix somewhere. Probably a good idea to give it a bit of a stir as well. There may be sediment that kind of collects on the bottom, some cloudy looking, and all good, all fine. Actually, it's the bacteria and the yeast that we want in the kombucha that's making that cloudy mixture. I'm going to take this and I'm going to pour it into a large container that I can utilize to pour into the jars. And really important, because most of us want to keep brewing kombucha, that you don't take all of this first ferment out. This is actually going to be our starter tea for our next batch of kombucha. When we did our first ferment, we actually got some of this from a friend. This time we're using our own. We don't need to have any more from a friend. So always make sure that you save some of your first ferment to help start your next batch of kombucha, which you can do right away. Usually for a jar this size, to get a good second brew, we probably want to have about a cup to a cup and a half. So there we've got about a cup and a half. So this amount could also go into our glass jars. And then put your SCOBY and your starter tea for your next brew aside. And what I've done here today is I have a NutriBullet. If you have a little blender at home, food processor, any of those devices will work. You can hand mash as well. It doesn't need to be anything expensive. But what I've taken here is blueberries and strawberries and a little bit of fresh ginger, and I've pureed them around. My own experience has been that using pureed fruits seems to really help with CO2 production, so I get more fizz for my kombucha if the fruit is pureed. It also means that I can drink all of it once I've finished my second ferment, so I'm getting all of the nutritional benefits and the fiber benefits of the fruit that I'm using in my second ferment. And the amount that I put in each one of these jars, and you can vary. You may find that your preferences, you like a little more fruit or you like a little less fruit. This is very much about custom making kombucha to the way you like it to be. I'm just going to show you what I have sort of found that I really enjoy. So I'm going to take a funnel and my blueberries and strawberries and a little bit of ginger, and I'm going to put about what I consider 2 fingers at the bottom of each one of these jars. So that is a little bit of extra sugar for our kombucha that's gone through its first ferment. As you can remember, we did put sugar in with our first ferment kombucha, but most of the bacteria and the yeast have eaten that as their food supply, so there's not a lot of sugar left. And we do need some extra sugar for those bacteria and yeast to start eating again and producing gas in the form of CO2, which makes that nice bubbly that we're going for. So now I'm going to add my first ferment to that nice mixture of strawberries, blueberries, and ginger. Do remember that you need what's called a little bit of headspace, and for anybody who's done canning, you'll probably be familiar with that term of headspace. We're going to leave a little bit open at the top because this mixture is going to rise a little bit, and we don't want to have too much pressure that it actually could blow off the lid. I seal it really tight. Make sure that's on really, really tight. If you have a flip jar that you're using, make sure once again that you've opened it, sealed it, make sure the ring is flat against the surface, and you've pulled down this part until you hear that sound, that snap. That means that it's made a good tight seal. Once you've filled all your jars, we're going to, once again, we want this to be active, so we want to put it into an area that has room temperature or is relatively warm, because we want that bacteria and that yeast to become really active and start eating again. And what they're going to be eating this time as their food source is the fruit that you've put in your second ferment. I usually have found that with the amount of fruit that I added to this jar today, I'm safe to leave this for about 48 hours. I usually get a good amount of fizz after 48 hours of sitting on a counter somewhere. If you're really concerned about it exploding, it hasn't happened to me too often, but it does occasionally, especially if you forget and leave them there longer than 48 hours. You can always use a cooler. Put it in the cooler without cool packages or anything like that. Just an area where they're confined, so if one does explode, it's not going to be on your ceiling. It'll just be in the inside part of that container. Leave that out for 48 hours, and then you can put it in your fridge. Once we put it in the fridge, it kind of, the yeast and the bacteria aren't dead in there, but they're not going to be as active anymore. They're not going to be producing more CO2. So once you put it in the fridge, it kind of dampens down that CO2 production. After it's gone in the fridge, or as soon as you've given it the 48 hours, you can enjoy your kombucha right away. And I did bring out a sort of a sample for you. This was a strawberry and ginger one that I did. And it was done, and it's probably been sitting in the fridge for about 2 weeks, maybe 3 for me. And just, I'm not going to fully open it, but I will kind of give you a suggestion. If you haven't opened one before, you can kind of see from the seal at the top that it's a little bit convex, meaning it's pushing up on the outer part of the lid, which means it's going to have a lot of CO2 production. Sometimes it can kind of look like a volcano eruption when you first open the jar. So I found, just to be safe, get yourself a plastic bag, put it over the top, put your kombucha bottle in a bowl or a large glass, and open it this way. That way it kind of contains the fizz, and you'll still have all your kombucha in the bowl that you can now pour into a glass to enjoy. So that is the second ferment that we do with kombucha, and it's a little bit shorter process than the first ferment we did, but I hope that you enjoy making your own kombucha, and please do experiment a little bit with different flavors and textures that you like in your kombucha to find the right mix just for you. Enjoy!